of the anger in the community, if not the world, it's best for employers to have a sense of preparedness so when the it can't happen here event happens, your people understand protocol systems and responses to protect them, others, and other clients as much as possible. We're doing this in part with funding from a SET grant from MIOSHA. What we want to do is do a quick review of different kinds of incidents that have been happening nationally. What are employer concerns in terms of protecting employees? And then what are some of the OSHA litigation exposures that go with workplace violence incidents and assaults? And then we want to talk about the concept of situational awareness, because prevention and avoidance of victimization is going to be one of your best strategies. And very often perpetrators will display warning signs, and we want to create an awareness in your employees to recognize them, to either leave that situation or avoid encounters. We want to talk about verbal and nonverbal behavior indicators of potential aggressive people, and what do you do in an active shooter incident, and then put it all together within the context of a comprehensive violence prevention system. You know, certainly recent incidents in Paris, in San Bernardino, at the Planned Parenthood shooting, at the Oregon Community College, certainly shows the need for employers and employees to be vigilant as to warning signs, because, you know, we all seem to be potential targets of people with anger. Employers, you know, have to have a sense of concern about what happens to their employees and customers because, one, they care about if there's physical harm to their employees. There's a lot of liability exposures, which we're going to talk about in a moment. There's also government scrutiny. In other words, federal, sometimes state, local agencies are going to come on site and take a look at what did you know and when did you know it. And then we talk about public confidence. Everybody wants your customers, your consumers, to feel that this is a safe agency. An incident can sort of shatter an image. I mean, if you think of what comes to mind when you think of the U.S. Postal Service, a lot of people think of workplace violence. And then, you know, employee morale can be compromised if there is a kind of incident where people are looking at their own safety and reliving the event. There could be destruction of assets, a sabotage, and productivity goes down, and also your brand name can be compromised. Our philosophy is that workplace violence is a business problem that can be managed. In other words, people feel, well, everything's sort of an isolated event. How can we predict it? Well, you try and prevent things by having a sound foundation of warning signs and awareness so your people know what to do, who to call, and how to respond if there's a situation of concern. And some of the basic questions you as employers have to ask are, do you have a written violence prevention policy? Does everybody in your organization know the consequences of violating this policy? And also, do you have a policy for your codes of conduct for your customers so that they know if they cross a line, they either may be denied service or deal with consequences too, so they don't feel that they have a license just to abuse your workers and counselors? Have you done a front-end analysis? Have you looked at the kinds of incidents and near misses you've had so you can build in responses in case they were to repeat themselves? Do you have a threat assessment and safety team? So if a threatening situation is reported, do you have an internal group of trained people who could assess the credibility of the threat, intervene with the target of the threat, your employee, and also deal with the potential perpetrator of the threat, be another coworker, or is it a consumer, or is it a customer, or an outsider? And then have you trained your supervisors and have you trained your employees as to what is our policy, what are the behavioral indicators of potentially violent people, who do we call to report this, and how your organizational response if you get a report of concern. And then have you practiced active shooter drills and lockdown exercises So if somebody comes to your organization, you have a response capability in order to manage that event as possible. And then in the aftermath, you have crisis response protocols so you can reduce the individual impact of trauma on individuals affected and your organization, and also your consumer and customer population. And that's how you create a foundation of readiness to try and avoid that degree of violence where there's foreseeability. So when we also talk about generally what are we doing, we're trying to protect our people, our facilities, our proprietary information systems we see every day, cyber attacks, cyber extortion, cyber corruption of our data. So that should now become part of your organizational priorities, as well as protecting your people, and then also, you know, your brand name. Your action plan is we need to assess our risks and the reality of what our people do, where they work, the work environments, community, home, travel situations. We need to look at the kinds of threats they may encounter and then manage safety plans to manage those threats. Then we want to train our employees, implement our plan, and then practice our plan so everybody knows what to do when these low-frequency situations occur. When we talk about violence, we're talking about a range of activities. We're talking about verbal threats, domestic violence. You know, somebody will come into the workplace because they've either been stalking or they're angry at a current or an ex-spouse because the predictability of their work location and their schedule allows the perpetrator to get to target. And domestic violence is a very significant source of targeted violence in the community. Harassment, intimidation, stalking of our employees, assault, sexual contact, flat tires, corrupting emails, beating, kicking, shoving, stabbing, computer hacking, extortion, and murder, and now we look at terrorism. So we always recommend when you develop your violence prevention program, do it within the context of an all-hazards approach so that your people are cross-functionally trained to manage a variety of risks and not just a, one risk of an assault. OSHA is very active in this field. They have guidelines for healthcare, and they have high guidelines as to how companies should develop policy systems and structures in order to develop internal programs. Everything stems from the General Duty Clause, which says the employer has to furnish to each of his employees employment and a place of employment free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm to its employees. You know, in the old days, it meant that if you had toxic gases, you had to look at how do you manage the fumes, what kind of personal protection equipment you have, and you train your employees how to manage chemicals or high-lows or electrical work so they don't become harmed. Now what's happening is when an employee or a customer or a client makes a threat, we now have an identified hazard, a threat, from somebody who's threatening to harm or kill somebody, and then the General Duty Clause becomes applicable. OSHA has developed 4 types of perpetrators when they look at a concept of violence in the workplace. A type 1 perpetrator is an outsider who comes in to commit a crime. That's your opportunistic criminal, that's your terrorist, that's somebody in the community who may rob or beat up one of your employees as they're working in community-based or home settings. A type 2 perpetrator is somebody who's receiving a service from you who then attacks a caregiver. In hospitals, it's a patient who attacks a nurse or a doctor. In social work or schools, it's a student or a client or a customer who attacks the person who's giving them the services. The type 3 perpetrator is a current or a former employee who attacks a supervisor or a coworker, and that's usually under the classification of the disgruntled employee going postal. The type 4 perpetrator is usually a domestic partner or a significant other who commits assault against the person, but, you know, it's not necessarily job-related, but it's personality-related or relationship-related, but it plays itself out in the confines of the workplace. So the kinds of potentially different attackers that can cause risk are our angry, frustrated individual customer or client or consumer, people who are mentally ill, people who are intoxicated, domestic cases, the opportunistic criminal gang members if your people are doing community-based work, and then the disgruntled coworker or fired employee, the homeless, or the disgruntled citizen or terrorist. And those are the kinds of people we want to be having a situational awareness of. There are a lot of different kinds of litigation exposures for acts of violence. From third parties, they have an ability to sue on the basis of wrongful death, failure to do a good background check, negligent training, negligent supervision, negligent security. From the employee who's the subject, that is, if you get a threat from an employee that you're taking adverse action against, they often sue on the basis of invasion of privacy, job discrimination, age discrimination, First Amendment freedoms, or an ADA violation. In terms of the employee, a strong policy statement is your defense against a lot of those types of litigation exposures. So you want to have a foundation based upon the OSHA guidelines and a policy statement and structures so people know how to respond, what to look for, and what to do. When we do a lot of work in active shooter, you know, a lot of times people are saying, well, gee, what can I do? It sounds like it's a random event. There's nothing I can do. And we really talk about situational awareness. And a lot of times victims say, boy, it was a really surprise. I never thought it could happen to me when I was visiting a client or when I was going anywhere. But when you do sort of a psychological autopsy of these kinds of events, there were often verbal and nonverbal warning signs that often your employees could pick up on if they knew what to look for, if they were situationally aware of the circumstances that they were in. And our thesis is before you can respond to a threat, you must recognize that a threat is existing in the office, in the community, or while somebody is traveling. Gavin DeBecker wrote a book called The Gift of Fear, and his thesis is that very often when we have a fear response, when we're in contact with another person, a little voice goes off in our gut and off in our head, and we suddenly say, something is not right about this situation. Something's not right in the person's dress. Something's not right in the person's approach behaviors towards me. Something is not right how they're looking at me. Something is not right on the street I'm walking down when I see three people just loitering around. And it's a fear response based upon our years or decades of survival. So like when the saber-toothed tiger was going to come to us, we either developed a fight or a flight response. We either figured, let's get out of here because before we become a victim, or if we have to fight, we have to then mobilize our survival responses. And when we work with companies and the human service and social service agencies, we really want to get them to start taking a look at how can you reassess, redefine your environment so that you can start translating behaviors of others around you into a survival strategy. And that's what we need to emphasize in this kind of awareness with our employees. So situational awareness is what is going on around them, whether they're in home or community or office settings, and what can they do to start reading who are potential threats, what are escape routes, and what are potential opportunistic weapons that we can use to defend ourselves if we become a target of an assault, And ultimately, how do we spot a developing situation so we can try avoiding it? Or if we see a situation escalate, how can we leave before bad things or an attack happens to us? And then if we have to act, what are our choices for action in terms of, can we lock down the facility, can we hide, or do we have to actually take a physical response to defend ourselves? And usually you always hope that's your last choice if the other two kinds of options aren't successful. And when we get into active shooter response, we're going to really reinforce what this concept means in terms of behavioral action. One of the things we want to train all field and office staff is what we call 10 seconds to personal safety. Whenever you arrive at your office, at a building, at a community location, at someone's home, take 2 seconds to look around. Does everything look normal? Or there are groups of people who look ominous, who are congregating. If you go into a 7-Eleven store and there's no one there, that's not normal. If you see people looking very frightened as you arrive at a situation, that's a warning sign that maybe you should start assessing, are there risks? When you get out of your vehicle, take 2 seconds to scan the parking lot, the area. Are there people loitering around? Are people going to and from their cars? When you approach your destination, take 2 seconds to look around. Are there people in alleyways? Are there people on the streets? Are there people arguing? When you get into the door of the location, you look inside. Does everything look like people are calm, they're functioning normally, or is something out of sorts and out of control? Do you have an uneasy feeling? Because your gut, your unconscious survival skills may be picking up on stuff before you put it into words. And then as you enter, look around to see if anything is out of place. And then you use these 2 seconds of awareness as you do everything in reverse. You scan the door as you exit, you scan the parking lot, you scan entranceways, so you can look for possible threats to say, maybe I need to go back into where I came from, maybe I need to avoid things, and I certainly don't want to play on my cell phone walking back and forth on street or parking lot settings, which will hamper my visual cues as to what are potential risks and alerts. We talked about trying to have a level of awareness, and we talk about color codes of awareness. Some people are just totally white. They're totally unaware of what they're going. They're walking down the streets with their iPhones. They're not looking at people around them. And they're not looking at, who may be a potential threat. There's level yellow, and that's the level we want to get our employees to think about. Wherever you go, you want to scan, look around you, look for potential threats. Level orange is once you see a situation that looks threatening, maybe a potential robber, an attacker, somebody who's intoxicated, a client who's agitated, you want to zoom in on the threat to say, what is my choices if they attack me? And then red is when an initiation, just as an attack is starting. Can I get out? Can I keep out? Or do I have to fight? And black is when you freeze, and then, you really become set up for a victimization. And, when we think about condition yellow, a good example of condition yellow is when you're driving down and you come to a crossroads, and the light is sort of green and it just turns to yellow. So what do most people do? They say, aha, I better look around. If I go through the intersection, are the cars further enough on the other side so I can make it? Is there somebody bearing down on me so if I stop, I may get, rear-ended, or I look to the left and right? Are there people going through the intersection? And then I look around and do I see any police cars? And then I'll make a real quick decision after I did a situational assessment, and then I'll make my decision to either stop or go through the light. And that's the kind of awareness we really want to cultivate, your employees to have. And what are we asking them to do? We're asking them to think of who are the bad guys, who are the people who pose threats to them and may cause problems for them? And, you know, do people see the warning signs? Okay, now, when we see this girl with her ears shut off, so she's limited her sensory awareness, she's focusing on a phone, so she's limiting her visual assessment, her environment, and her attention span is not on somebody who could be lurking behind her. And whether it's in a school, whether you just get into your car in a parking lot, and the first thing you do is you get on your phone, instead of you lock your door or you look around who may be in your environment, you're creating a potential for your victimization. So let's go on to who are some of the kind of potential people who cause, you know, risks to people, and what are some of the countermeasures that we may have. So I just want to see one thing here. When we look at the potential for what are some of the behavioral indicators of risk, we want to know what are some of the things we want to look for. Only the Swami can predict violence. The problem with the prediction of violence is you can't do it. So what we want to do is look for different kinds of warning signs to see what is the potential for harm. There are two kinds of violence. One is called effective violence. The other is called predatory violence. Predatory violence is where there's a perpetrator out there who made up his mind he's going to attack, carjack, or rob somebody, and he's going to look for an easy target. And, you know, their mindset is on it, and if you're going to be that target, then you have to figure out, what am I going to do when I get attacked? In effective violence, you have an opportunity to affect the level of violence. Let's say you're dealing with a client who's getting upset, they're getting agitated, they're saying you haven't given them the kind of services, you haven't gotten their payment, you haven't given them the resources, and they keep on getting angry and angrier and angrier. You can try diffusing and de-escalating them and calming them down rather than confronting them. So how you respond to an angry client or customer will have an effect ultimately as to whether they hit a threshold where they choose to attack and or, you know, respond in an aggressive way. When we look at who are the violent people, we want to look at shooter characteristics. We want to look at behaviors, not profiles. We want to look at people who are very brittle. They're very inflexible. They collect injustices. They're always angry, always seeing themselves as victims. They feel persecuted by others. They feel persecuted by friends, people in the community, and then they may start feeling persecuted by you and your agency, and it's their services. Often they see themselves as an outsider. They feel alienated. They feel alone. And they see themselves as this victim, and they externalize blame. They don't look at what they are contributing to their isolation from others or why others are avoiding them. They just blame it all on others. And when you see this constellation of behavior, these are often people who bring kerosene to their own fire, and then they get angry, and then they engage in assaultive behaviors. Some of the examples of these people who became active shooters was in Santa Barbara. The shooter there was the student who felt isolated. Girls wouldn't go out. If you look at his work on the internet, he was angry at the world for isolating him, and then he took that isolation and anger and he says, I'm going to teach you all that I'm the toughest person around. In the Connecticut brewery shooting, Omar Thornton was fired, but rather than look at he was fired because they had him on videotape stealing product, he came in and started shooting 8 people in the plant because he felt that he was being victimized by them. Cho, who was the shooter at Virginia Tech, had a long history of mental illness. And, you know, in the videos he sent to the media, he talked about how he was victimized by others, how people dumped on him. They perverted his soul. They refused to give him any respect. So he's now teaching all the people in the community, for the sake of all the other victims who are silent and nobody fights for them, he's going to fight for them. The point that I'm trying to emphasize is that what we want to do is when we see customers or employees or coworkers making these kinds of statements, we want to use that as an opportunity for early intervention so we can open up dialogues with these individuals to understand what is their grievance, why are they unhappy, and then help them plan and problem solve what it is they're seeking so that they don't have to take that level of anger, cross a threshold of attack, and then attack us or other organizations in the community. When we talk about high-risk behaviors, we have to train our staff and employees that when they hear of a specific threat of harm to an identifiable target, when somebody says, you know, I'm going to get Joe in the parking lot at 3 o'clock with my 9mm because he humiliated me and didn't give me what I was entitled to by your agency, that's a threat that has a time, a place, a means, a motive, and a system to deliver. And, you know, there are different kinds of threats. One is a veiled threat where somebody says, you know, it's going to be a sad day at your agency, but they don't specify a specific type of harm to an identifiable target. It's more an ominous statement that makes us feel uneasy. And certainly we want to gather more information as to why did somebody say it. Then you have conditional threats where somebody says, if you don't get my check in time, I'm going to go in there and bomb your agency. Or if you don't give me the services I'm entitled to, I'm going to get you and everybody else. That's more of a specific kind of threat because it says if a condition isn't going to be met, then I'm going to act in violence versus what we were just talking about, the specific threat of harm to identifiable targets. And when you hear those threats, you have an immediate responsibility to initiate a protective response for the targets of the threat and people in the agency, because if somebody carries that out and somebody says, gee, I didn't think they meant it, you know, then you're really going to be subject to those litigation exposures of negligent security, negligent training, and negligently maintaining a safe environment. What are some of the verbal and nonverbal threats we want to train our staff to look for when they're dealing with coworkers or customers or people in the community? One are verbal threats that we were just talking about. People who are clenching their jaws, frowning, faces becoming reddened, they're physically escalating tension within their body, perspiring, gesturing, you know, running hands around, finger pointing, intrusive questions. They make a question, you try to answer, then they shut you off, and they keep on asking question after question after question, making demands, scanning rooms, scanning your room or scanning the room that they're in. They could be, one, looking for accomplices if they're a predatory thief, or they may be looking at, if I attack this person, what is the way I can exit this facility? Sometimes they're pounding objects, they're menacing gestures, finger pointing. You know, when somebody takes their finger and they sort of run it under their throat like they're cutting their neck, they don't have to say, I'd like to kill you. The gesture is denoting and communicating the threat. Piercing, staring, darting eyes, shouting, rambling, pacing, you know, feelings of suspiciousness that you can't alleviate as you deal with them. Sometimes signs of imminent attack are as you're trying to communicate constructively with somebody and they're getting physically and verbally agitated, all of a sudden they stop looking at you. It's very often, these are pre-attack behaviors because they're thinking about, if I attack him, what part of the body am I going to attack? When you see excessive emotionally upset behaviors of decompensation, yelling, crying, pacing, swearing, and they're losing emotional and cognitive control, that can often be a pre-indicator where they may attack you. Shaking fists, gross physical motions, and then they suddenly stop all motion. You know, that could be the pre-attack of, okay, I made a decision, I'm going to assault this person, how do I do it? Target glances and boxer stance. A boxer stance is when somebody turns themselves on a 45-degree angle like a boxer so that they could have a lead hand to punch you and keep your balance, keep their balance, and then follow up with another kind of assaultive punch. A target glance is where they suddenly start looking at your face or your chin or your knees or your hands. They often look at, if I'm going to initiate an attack, those are parts of the body I'm going to attack first. The repetitive questioning I already mentioned. And then when they start closing space between you and them, and they don't give you any space to react or to put barriers between you and them, that could be certainly a forewarning of an attack. We didn't bring you here to depress you. We brought you here to empower you. And now we want to talk about what are some of the, countermeasures to violence, and what are some of the new thinking now in terms of how people and organizations can protect their employees and customers. When we look at active shooter and intruder events, the philosophy is, well, don't do anything, let's call 911. Let's hide and hope. We don't have to set up protocols. Let's lock down or evacuate, or let's look at, if we have to fight, what are the defensive and counter strategies we can do to protect our people during active events? So active shooter and response is not only active responses on the part of the shooter, but active response on the part of our employees and our organization. And you know what? Hope is not a strategy. You increase your chance of survival through pre-planning, by training your people what to do, having, physical vulnerability assessments and awareness of how to evacuate, the situational awareness so you can see attacks coming, particularly if it's from a client or a coworker, and then taking action and knowing what action to take, and frankly, luck. So survival is about seizing opportunities. Remember the 3 Americans on the train when the gunman came in with a machine gun. There were 573 people on the train, and the 3 Americans saw that person, and immediately they went to attack the gunman because they figured if he got into position with his automatic weapon, he could start shooting people. So they made a gut decision. They had better chances to survive by attacking the perpetrator than by waiting. And while one person did, in fact, get cut up, everybody else was then able to swarm the person, get him down, and save the lives of everybody on that train. So when aggression erupts, if you trained your people in verbal diffusion and de-escalation skills, that's very good. But that's the really source of another training. So train people how to de-escalate, diffuse and de-escalate if possible. On the other hand, when you have an armed active intruder or a shooter, what do we do now? And, we talked about, the assessment of the event. Basically, your survival options are run, hide, and fight. Run if you can, hide if you can't run, or running puts you in the sights of the gunman, and fight if you try and get away or the gunman is in direct contact with you. And that's something we want to spend a few seconds thinking about. There's something called a decision-making loop, and that is, and you want to have people rehearse this, so when they hear, let's say there's a gunman or an intruder, they say, oh my God, what do I do? What you do is you observe what's going on, you orient yourself as to what is your prediction, you decide what is your best choice, and then you act. And this is what you do in pre-training of your employees. You want to assess, okay, seems to be a gunman in our facility. I can hear shots. Now, is he facing me? No, so that's an indirect contact. A direct contact is when the gunman is in the room facing me and I have no place to hide. So with indirect contacts, what you want your employees to think about, okay, it's indirect contact. Am I in a securable location with no path of escape? Well, if I'm in a conference room or I can get into a storeroom and then I can lock it down and put barriers between me, then I don't have to fight because the attacker's not in my area. Running would probably put me inside of the path of the gunman. How can I secure my location? That's my best choice. That's what I'll do. So you want to deny, your action is deny access, target hardening where you're at with chairs or file cabinets, get out of sight, and only prepare to fight if the attacker tries coming into your room. Now, in the second scenario, where the attacker is in view of you and you can't run without being shot, you want to say, observe, okay, the person's facing me, no path of escape, I am in mortal danger, so I have to figure out now what do I do. So I have to have contact with the killer and I have to fight, and then I have to think of, okay, how am I going to fight? And this is what we want to help train your employees with. So when you are at risk of attack, can you create space? Can you create boundaries? Can you move in different directions? Sometimes you can use voice control. You want to say, stop, put down the hammer, put down the gun, stay back. So you might be able to interrupt his train of concentration, a path, if only to give you a moment to either rush that person or get them to reconsider. You want to look environmentally. Are there barriers? Are there file cabinets, doors, Xerox machines, walls that you can run for that can give you cover? You want to look for opportunistic tools, defensive tools, clipboards, umbrellas, lamps, books, keys, rocks, a fire extinguisher that you could use to throw at the attacker to cause them to flinch. Are there shields you could use? Pillows, briefcases, attaché cases, even a computer, you put it in your chest. Garbage lid cans or doors if you're outside. So when shots are fired, the first choice, if you can't avoid and hide, is running. But do you train your people when you go into a theater, when you go into a restaurant, when you go into your own office? Do they know the escapers? Have you practiced evacuation drills? And if you're going to run and you have the opportunity to run, run even if others don't follow. Think of what happened at World Trade Center Tower 2. A lot of people stayed in the tower even after it was attacked. Then when the second plane came, those above the 91st floor were doomed because they couldn't get out when they did have a 20-minute opportunity to otherwise do so. Leave your belongings behind and also tell other people, don't enter this zone. Help people have a plan for the disabled. Keep your hands visible so when cops come, they see that you don't have a weapon because they don't know who the perpetrator is and who it's not. And then you follow the instructions of the police. And then when you're outside, then you call 911 and share to them what you know. If you have to hide, and are there places you can hide or lock yourself in? Could it be an office, a storeroom, a utility room, a bathroom that you can lock? And it's a place that won't restrict your options, maybe later if you can flee. Block heavy furniture with the door so that somebody, if they open up the door, will see a desk or a file cabinet there. Remember, in an active shooter situation, these individuals often look for how many people can I kill. If they encounter a door that's going to take a lot of time to get in, they may just move on to the next place so that they can find more targets, and that's how you can be safer. Call 911. Now, how can you defend yourself if you go into a conference room, a training room, a storeroom? You know, look around what's available to help you opportunistically. You can take a belt and put it around the door hinges so you can almost prevent somebody from coming in. If the doors open in and there are double doors, take a lamp cord, a computer cord, wrap it around both doors so that if somebody tries pushing it, it won't easily give way. Then if we decide our only course is to take action, we have to have a mindset of saying, you know what, no one's going to come to save us. It's like the gentleman on the train. We have to defend ourselves. How are we going to best do it? So you have to say, don't let me freeze, even though that may be an initial response of shock. We have to mobilize our aggressive instincts, look for opportunistic weapons, and then we have to confront the assailant, and we have to fight even if we got wounded. And I think what happened on the French train is the great example. The perpetrator had a box cover as well as a machine gun, so when he was slashing the person with the box cutter, the other people who swarmed him then took him down. So while one person did get injured, everybody survived. And you have to have this contingency mindset planning in your employees so they say, oh my God, I have nothing to do but cower in a corner and become a passive target for an active shooter. So when we fight, what you want to teach your employees is spread out. Don't stand together. So if they are shooting, you have, not a concentration of targets, but everybody is spread out. Say, make a plan. A plan is very simple. If this person comes in, you run for the left leg, you run for the right leg, I'll get the left arm, you grab the right arm, you throw something at his head, and let's throw a chair to make him flinch. And let's rush them and let's act as a team. And this is called swarming. And you do whatever it takes. If you have an opportunity, you flee. Here's a picture of swarming. You see somebody grabbing the person's right leg, the left arm. This person's going for the right arm. And that way you can dismantle. Don't forget, these people aren't trained killers. And this is going to throw off their rhythm. It's going to throw off their planning. And they're going to say, my God, I didn't, understand this. You notice in the literature that most of the time when police come, the shooters kill themselves because they're really not dealing or wanting to encounter trained response people. So what they'll do is, even if people are civilians, they'll usually succumb and you'll destroy their rhythm and maximize your own chance of survival. What are some of the opportunistic weapons your employees can use? A hammer, a fire extinguisher, a can of Coke, get a telephone, get a jacket, get a chair, get a toolbox, a regular chair, tools if it's in a workroom. Anything that you can pick up, you throw at the perpetrator, and the natural response when we throw something at somebody is to kind of flinch and to change our rhythm. And those are the moments when you rush the person. If they have a 9mm and they're changing clips, that's the moment that you start using to attack the individual. And that's what we talk about. Survival is about seizing opportunities, but the situational awareness and the pre-incident training is telling your employees, nobody's going to come and get you. This is what must be going through your mind, not seeing yourself in a casket, but seeing yourself taking action against the intruder or the shooter. And then once the event is over, you want to have a recovery plan to have trauma and humanitarian assistance counseling with your employees, with your customers, if it happens in your workplace, to reduce the impact of trauma and then to restabilize your organization in terms of morale and productivity, to put in perspective the awful event that just has occurred. Now, we talk about developing a comprehensive workplace violence prevention system. When we do this training throughout the state, we often ask people, how many of you have active shooter programs? Well, they're just starting to design them. And then we say, but these should only be designed within the context, or it's more powerful to design them within the context of a comprehensive violence prevention system. And how many of you have a workplace violence policy? Well, about 70% usually raise their hand. How many of you have done awareness training and set up safety teams? And usually only 10% raise their hand. So what that tells me is everybody has a paper policy and no one's going to know what to do during a real threat or a real incident of potential violence. So what we want to share with you is a foundation, a structure. So if you're going to develop a system, that'll help you handle a variety of threats as well as an active shooter event. The components you want to have in an active shooter situation is program ownership. Who in your agency is going to take control of the active shooter program? Is it going to be human resources? Is it going to be health and safety? Because, these are OSHA-driven programs. Is it going to be legal? Is it going to be security? Is it going to be the superintendent of the facility? But somebody has to take ownership and coordinate the variety of activities we're going to discuss now. we want to look at the scope of our program. Is it going to only be at our main headquarters? Is it going to be at our satellite clinics? If we're a national organization, is it going to be at all of our sites nationally? And then what is our policy? And we need to say in our policy that violence is unacceptable, that anybody acts in threatening ways or intimidates others will be subject to a range of consequences from discipline to termination, and anybody who violates this policy loses their expectation of privacy in those areas that need to be investigated in order to ensure the safety of everyone else. So that way, if it's an employee who's making threats and you do a background and you start investigating, they can't claim invasion of privacy or defamation or slander allegations because they put on notice that this is what the consequences would be. Then you need to have a threat management infrastructure. You need to set up a safety team, which is usually a cross-functional team of employees, of people from different business units, HR, health and safety, a threat assessment expert, legal, and senior management, so that when a threat comes in, it's given to these people and they assess the credibility of the threat, who is the target of the threat, who's the perpetrator, what organizational resources do we have to mobilize, and what is the level of risk this threat is posing. But somebody is in charge now to coordinate that information, and all employees know whom to call. Then we want to have systems to report and emergency notification systems. All your employees have to be able to know, how do I tell somebody there's a threat? Whether I'm in an office and I'm all alone with somebody, or I'm in the community, or I'm in the waiting room. And then you want to be able to notify your other people by voicemail, by electronic page, by text messages that we're in an at-risk situation. You know, if you're not here, don't come in. You know, we're in a situation of lockdown. Then what you want to do is train your supervisors, your managers, and your first line staff and your threat assessment team. How do we investigate the credibility of the threat? What are the questions we want to ask? How do we ask these questions in a way that doesn't violate the individual human rights and legal rights of an individual versus the general duty responsibility to everybody else? What questions do we ask if we have a stalker? What questions do we ask if somebody makes a conditional threat? And then how do we interview the targets of these threats? And then what criteria do we use to say this is an imminent threat, this is a situation where we can do coaching and counseling? Usually the outcome of any investigation is 6 outcomes. 1, it's a misunderstanding. 2, the person violated the policy. It's a coaching counseling situation. 3, we're going to do progressive discipline. They violated our policy. 4, the behavior and threats were so severe, we're going to do a high-risk termination. 5, a crime has been committed. The police are going to come. There's going to be a criminal prosecution. And 6, the person is so out of touch with reality, we're going to have to go for an involuntary psychiatric commitment. So your team has to know these outcomes and know what behavior of data you're collecting to justify the level of response in managing that threat. The incident management is, once you get that threat, you have to mobilize your internal security and external law enforcement and threat assessment resources to protect people who have been threatened, as well as the targets of the threat and other people in your agency. You need to have protocols as to what to do, so you're all not standing around saying, well, what do we do now? The post-incident I just spoke about. Then you want to institutionalize this by setting up training for different audiences within your organization. The different audiences that need to be trained in your violence prevention and active shooter survival are senior management. They have to know what are the response requirements, what are the litigation exposures, what are the OSHA expectations, what is the structure and functioning of the team within your agency that's going to take control of these incidents, and then they need to endorse and make available people for training, for exercises, and for institutionalization of the program over time. Then you need to train, that's usually a 2-hour training. Then you need to train a threat assessment team. The threat assessment team is a 1 to 2 day training where you train the team how to handle and recognize a variety of risks, how to recognize somebody who's mentally ill, how to recognize a stalker, how to recognize a psychopath, how to recognize the domestic threats. So when these warning signs come in, they could look at the warning signs, assess credibility, and then practice coordinating with local law enforcement, direct security, contract security, on-site security if you have, in order to protect people. Then you want to do training for your first-line supervisors and managers, union reps if you're unionized. They need to know what is the policy, what are the behavioral warning signs, who do I call when I have a concern, what is the initial fact-finding I need to do to develop a threat incident report, and how do I talk to the person making the threat. And then you want to roll this out to your employees. Again, similarly, what is the policy, who do you call, some verbal diffusion de-escalation skills, and then how will threats be managed when we make a threat, and then how do we handle active shooter events. And then you implement and institutionalize the program so people don't forget it. Depending upon the size of your agency, your threat team is often a team leader, somebody from HR, facilities management, legal, health and safety, union if you're unionized, a threat assessment expert, somebody you can call 24 hours a day so you can get somebody to validate the credibility and level of risk to the threat, risk management and security if you have internally. And then that team will be your threat assessment team. You then enhance your activities by looking at your workplace violence program and develop policies and training to include active shooter, intruder preparedness. You want to coordinate with your local Office of Emergency Management and Police Department or Sheriff's Department so you know them, they know you, invite them over, go to lunch with them, let them see your facilities. So if you ever call them to your facility, they know what they're walking in and they know who the people and the stakeholders involved are. You also want to review your people and access control management systems. You know, when you have people come to your agency, does anybody greet them? Are there barriers so they can't go into all the primary or secondary offices? Is there some control in the lobby? Is there a badge system? Do you have circuit TVs? Do you have a way of notifying others from the front desk, like emergency distress buttons that a system is occurring? Do you have contract security? Is it armed? Is it unarmed? What's your response time with your local law enforcement? The panic notification systems I just mentioned. Can you establish barriers in your different facilities so people can't come in and just walk without somebody stopping them or seeing them? And then have you trained your staff in how to handle customer disruptions, customer to customer or family member disruptions? You know, how to handle intruders. What do they do if they see a fight? Who's the first person they call? And then what do they do with agitated and distraught people? The other thing is, once you have a plan, if you haven't done exercises, if you haven't really done a desktop or an evacuation plan or victim avoidance inoculation training, you really don't have a plan. So to have a piece of paper or you know, a 3-hole book with 200 sheets of paper is worthless if nobody knows where it is, how to access it, and what's in it. So exercising your plan, I think, gives people confidence and they'll know what to do. They'll get muscle memory as to how to handle these situations rather than they'll freeze. What we think about is that training to us is critical. Training saves lives. And our philosophy is too often people do not rise to the occasion. They sink to their level of training. And, you know, why do you train people for fire drills? Because if there's a fire, they need to know what to do. What if you have a hazmat release? You know, what do you do in terms of personal protection equipment? And you train and you exercise. And you need to do the same thing for an active intruder, active shooter, or the angry, disruptive client and customer, so people know what to do, they've practiced it, they know the resources, and they have confidence when they initiate a response. a final thought. It wasn't raining when Noah built the ark. The time for preparedness is now, before the incident. I mean, we look at what's happening in community colleges, in county offices, in plants, in schools, and there's an expectation by our communities and our customers that our leadership is responsibly looking at this and implementing survival and safety plans if something were to happen here. Abraham Lincoln once said, the most precious gift in the world after creating a human life is saving a human life. And I think that's really what we're doing when we set up these safety programs. And Einstein also once said, Albert Einstein said, you know, it's not the evil that men do, it's those that allow them to do it. We have to be that line in the stand, that line of responsible management, so that if evil comes to visit our people or our facilities, we have developed the systems, the policies, the training and awareness so our employees know what to do to protect themselves, their peers, their customers, and other people in our community. So we'd like to thank you for, listening to our thinking and some of these systems and policies that we think might be helpful for you to consider implementing in your respective places of work. And now let's turn it over to Gloria.
Okay, I have to unmute. First of all, I want to say thank you both to Marilyn Knight and Dr. Wolf for presenting today. Very valuable information. Again, a very timely information. Dr. Wolf and also Marilyn Knight work for a nonprofit for which they also provide training. It's at a cost, but if you'd like to contact them, their contact information is available on the screen.